everyone hear me? Mic working? Yes? Was that the nod, Mark? Mark, was that the nod? We are recording. Right. Hello everyone. I'm James. James, I should sound by the mic. I'm James Betteley. I'm working with Skelton Thatcher at the moment, many of you may have heard, and Mark just mentioned them a little earlier. I'm going to talk to you today about blending Agile and DevOps. How many people in the audience are involved in an Agile team, let's say? How many are involved in a DevOps team? How many are involved in a DevOps team silo? Kidding, don't be on that. Okay, so what really I'm going to be talking about is essentially trying to get the best out of these two worlds. So we quite often see, the last couple of years, let's go back a little bit, the last couple of years I've been working as a DevOps consultant, stroke Agile consultant. I've seen a lot of organizations rightfully say that they are Agile, they're doing Scrum, they're doing Kanban, they're doing something Agile frameworky, and they're also doing DevOps. So they can also say, we're using Kubernetes, Lambda, whatever, lots of Docker, lots of deployment automation, lots of cloudy stuff. Woohoo! So they can pretty much justifiably say that they are doing DevOps. But not really shifting the bar for the organization. So you'll have an Agile team and a DevOps team. And really they both seem to be doing really well, but the overall big picture is not actually being improved. So this is a story about how we try to challenge that and how we try to implement a slightly different framework, let's say, that's a bit of a blend between both Agile and DevOps. So that's the why. Here's the problem space. DevOps teams and Agile teams, we've all seen them, we all know what it's like to work in these Agile teams. Let's take Scrum as an example. Hands up who's doing Scrum. Form Scrum. Then you'll know what a Scrum team is made up of. Hands up who's in a DevOps team. There's a lot of people in a DevOps team, so we all also know what a DevOps team can look like. And who's working in an organisation where you'll get a dev team and an Agile team and a DevOps team. So yeah, that's perfect. Okay. So this can be problematic because it's localized optimization. Really, who's heard of localized optimization? Okay. And what do we know about localized optimization? Yeah, you may as well punch yourself in the face. Or put a little bit better there. Yeah, it doesn't help the big picture, so it doesn't shift the bar. So doing things in an Agile way, being able to, let's say, do sprints and continuously deliver stuff is all really good if you're delivering crap. Then it's not exactly going to shift the bar for you. Slinging rubbish quicker isn't really going to improve your life. Likewise with DevOps, automating the hell out of everything is great as long as you've got something good to automate or something really good to deliver. Here's another problem. Name the film, bit of a giveaway, it's written on the car. Jurassic Park. What year was this film out? 93. Oh, who said 93? Okay. Scrum was out in 1993. Scrum is as old as Jurassic Park. What were you doing in 1993 in the world of software development? We certainly weren't doing stats and PAS, were we? And that's what Scrum was written for, when we were shrink wrapping our software. In fact, we weren't even shrink wrapping it. I remember as a software developer in about 2000, 2001, I didn't even know what happened to my code after I checked it in. And we were one of the advanced ones because we had source control. So what exactly was Scrum made for? Scrum was made for getting developers and testers to work in parallel and checking in on how our progress was going after 2 weeks and producing something tangible, releasable, or throwawayable as it happened. Who is this? Come on. Well, who said that? You. Yeah, that's Marty Fellow. What was the song? What was the song that they? Wet, wet, wet. What was the song that they sung?
Love is all around.
Love is all around. Who said that? Sing it. Feel it in my fingers. I feel it in my toes. It's a song about pins and needles. DSDM. Who's been involved in DSDM? It's really prescriptive and lovely if you like really prescriptive stuff. Kind of like Scrum, but with loads of documentations and really, really more prescriptive. DSDM was a very, very popular Agile model, Agile framework, if you like. That was around in 1994, the same year as Wet, Wet, Wet's Love is All Around. So you see my point? These Agile frameworks that people continue to use to this day were built for a time that is just out of this world in terms of what we're now doing in software delivery. Napster and MySpace, what year? What year were they launched? Ooh, close. Higher. 99. Yeah, 1999.
Napster, I just ruined Napster.
Napster, yeah. Yeah, well, poor old Napster, what happened there? Highly illegal, obviously. But I picked those two because they are actually online services. Well, MySpace certainly, but Napster had sort of a big file sharing thing about it. But it was still something installed locally, if you remember. Anyone who was into file sharing in those days. Shame on you. So in summary, here's my point. Scrum 93, DSDM 94, XP came out at the same time as Napster and MySpace. So I know it's quite crazy, isn't it? Well, I say XP was released, but Extreme Programming Explained came back was released in 1999. SAS only started really gaining much traction in 2010, and PASS, even though it was launched in 2006, probably only started getting big numbers in terms of billion-dollar usage in around about 2012. I'd say multi-billion-dollar. So these technologies, which are now the de facto way of doing stuff, hosting stuff, and delivering stuff, were built decades after some of the processes that we still use today to deploy stuff to them and deliver our software. So essentially what I'm saying is technologies move faster than our processes. There's a few more problems. Has Agile been replaced by DevOps? Because surely, now that we're in this SAS and PASS world, there's a better way of doing things, right? And that's DevOps. Who would agree with that? No? So, I would also agree that it's not replaced Agile. DevOps hasn't become the de facto way of doing things in the SAS and PASS world. DevOps is highly involved and is a big part of the picture. But if we take a fairly ordinary software development lifecycle like this, here's what we're finding in terms of where the focus of Agile and DevOps is today. Looking like that, it's no surprise really. So Agile is born out of historically, Agile's come from planning, designing, and building and testing software. And DevOps now is very, very focused on automation, tooling, speeding up delivery, scalability, provisioning, that kind of stuff. So it's very focused on deploy and operate. So how do we hook the two up successfully? Because if you start to bolt DevOps on the end of your Agile process, it's too late. You've already designed the software wrong. And that's the problem. So we go back to this situation. Doing DevOps in series after you've done your Agile development is getting it wrong. So we've got to get it right up front. So why don't we change our Agile processes so we're building in some of our DevOps best practices, like operability as a feature. So on your product backlog, for example, I would expect to see your operability features, your scalability, deployability, testability, and so on. So those are things that we really need to look at blending into our Agile processes. But if you go by Scrum by the book, there's no room for that. In the official documentation, that's not something you should be doing. So if you look at a traditional Scrum team, there's no room in a Scrum team for anything other than your engineering and your Scrum Master and your product owner. So blending DevOps into your Agile processes, specifically with Scrum, could be quite challenging. Scrum is very, very prescriptive, and Scrum Masters who treat the Scrum Guide as their Bible can be quite hard to convince that blending their approach or blending this prescriptive methodology it's quite hard to actually convince them that that's the right thing to do. So how do we do it? Thankfully, other people have already done it. So there's a couple of good models to follow. Spotify, we've all heard that one. Is everyone kind of familiar with the Spotify model? I'm kind of lucky I worked with the guys who went and set up that model in Spotify. Probably about 2007 or 8, I worked in a company in North London. No, actually just around the corner from here, just up the road, near Old Street. Worked for a company called M-Blocks up there, and the guy who set up, did the CTO thing at Spotify and set up those squads and so on, worked with me there. So I know those guys quite well. And I like their story, so if you're not familiar with it, it's something that you should probably go and read about if you're keen on understanding how you can change an organisation by changing your processes and people and reporting lines and so on. And then Husqvarna, who are the chainsaw company, of course, are another really good one. Right, okay, they don't just make chainsaws, they do, you know, like you get the connected home, like British Gas does that, like connected home thing, is it British Gas? Or something like that? Anyway, you can basically automate your entire home, yeah? Well, you can automate your entire garden now. It's awesome. Like your sprinklers, your all sorts of stuff. Press of a button, cuts your hedge for you. I don't know how it is. Yeah. So Husqvarna are an interesting bunch. They've followed another model that is fairly similar and starts off with Scrum and then evolves, and we'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, I wanted to use these ones because I'm a little bit bored of the tired old Amazon, Netflix, and Etsy examples that everyone kind of uses, even though I am using Spotify. So yeah, here's a quick example. Spotify, surprise, surprise, started with Scrum. Who knew that? Why did they start with Scrum? For such a prescriptive model that's so different to what they do now, the reason why they started with it was because it was a good place to start. It was something to start with. It's prescriptive, it tells you what to do, it's easy to get into. And then they kind of realized that this is constraining us. It doesn't allow us to be as innovative as we want to be. Perhaps there's some scalability problems. So let's just evolve. We worked out, or they worked out rather, that agility is more important than Scrum. So Scrum, you may say, is agility, but it's not. Agility is just your philosophy, your approach, your values and principles, whereas Scrum is very prescriptive about practices. So they said the principles are more important to us than the practices, so let's create our own way of working. So they created these cross-functional squads, got rid of the Scrum teams, they intentionally renamed their Scrum Masters to Agile coaches because they wanted to differentiate themselves from Scrum. And they started to have this build, deploy, design, operate, full ownership model. So the teams were fully empowered. So they could basically decide what they wanted to do and how they were going to run it, how they were going to build it, how they were going to operate the whole thing. So there was full ownership within the teams. Scrum didn't really allow for that. So with this greater empowerment came greater motivation, which became then led into greater quality products. So they moved away from this Scrum model and adopted DevOps, if you like, or added a bit of DevOps into their Scrum process and created this, what's not really a bastardized version of Scrum, it's something completely different. And if you listen to what Spotify say now, and a lot of people, organizations go and try and copy the Spotify model, and Spotify will be the first people to say, don't do that. Go on your journey and find out what's right for you. I know it sounds like a cliche, but this is what they said. And it's absolutely right. So the journey is important as the destination sometimes. But learning some of their lessons is worthwhile. Don't just shortcut and try and mimic what they've done, but learning some of their lessons is quite worthwhile. Husqvarna, as you can see, what they do is essentially Scrum, but blended with DevOps. So they've got operability, etc. in their backlog. And it's underpinned by continuous delivery, and they have operations DevOps style people within their development teams. So their development teams aren't DevOps teams. They are a full hybrid of DevOps and QA. So that's sort of terrible threesome. What they were trying to do originally was start from this, move away from the Scrum-based model to reduce all the handovers. So they worked out So handing over from dev to QA to ops, or even going further back from the business to the BAs to the product owners and so on and so on and so on, was where all the problem areas were arising. And we see that all of the time in most of the organisations we work with. When we initially encounter them, we see all the problems at the handover points. So to reduce those handover points, they simply brought all the people together within one team. So no more handovers, and things started to work. So they then started to keep some of the good practices that they had in Scrum, so the retrospectives, the sprint planning, all of the usual stuff, the stand-ups, the collaboration, etc. and so forth, but they embraced their own model. One of the big things I should mention that they did at Husqvarna, which I truly believe in, is coaching the product owner, and they put a lot of emphasis on that. There's quite a bit of material on this if you can look it up, but it's I think that's one of the biggest wins you can actually get is have investment in your product owner, give them the ability to make the decisions on behalf of the product. A strong product ownership model, as well as a strong product owner, is the biggest win you can get, in my opinion. So, who works for Spotify here? Right, okay, so this slide's still true. As I said, they're keen to push their message that it's the principles that are important over the practices, and that's what we need to take from the Spotify model. Don't just try and follow it. So here are a few things that we actually can adopt, we can start to do. I've shortlisted this into about 9 steps. I distilled it down even further in a blog that's down to about 5 steps. But this is what I tend to recommend to organisations who are going at a DevOps or Agile transformation with a bit of a blank sheet of paper and are willing to be malleable. The first thing we need to get across is not to be afraid of change. If you're going to do Scrum by the book, it's simply not going to work. We can't blend DevOps into Scrum by the book. I'm working with one client at the moment who's really banging their head against a brick wall on this particular subject. So Scrum's not going to be the solution. If you're not going to change from Scrum, you may as well forget it. So you've got to embrace the fact that you're going to have to change. You're going to have to break some rules. Figure out your baseline Agile flavor. So if you want to follow something like an Agile framework such as Scrum or Kanban, I usually ask this question. Do you know what you're going to be working on for the next 2 weeks? If you do, then Scrum's not a bad flavor. If you don't know what you're going to be working on for the next 2 hours, let alone the next 2 weeks, because your priorities are changing, then Scrum's not for you. Scrum doesn't handle interruptions. When we were in the shrink-wrap software world where we do, who remembers Install Shield? I used to be an install script developer. That's a world of pain. And I remember I used to write these installers, and I didn't even know where I sent them. I sent them to some email address that I don't even know who this guy was, FTP'd them, and they were off, they were gone. I don't know how the product got anywhere near a user. That was totally foreign to me, and I was the closest person in the company to an actual user. Once I'd FTP'd that baby, it was gone. And that's kind of the world that Scrum was written for. You know, that's where we were working. Now, where we're in this sort of SaaS and PaaS world, we're getting live interruptions every day. We're deploying every day now. I mean, if we're being able to deploy every day, maybe A/B testing every release, let's say 3 or 4 releases a day, we're A/B testing them, we're bound to need to respond within 24 hours or a couple of days, not 2 weeks later. So we're going to have a model that's more responsive than Scrum, more adaptive. So if you can't work out what you're going to be working on for the next 2 weeks, it's going to be a much more shorter time period than that. Then Kanban possibly is a better approach for you. Building cross-functional teams is one thing that all the models that you see out there of successful DevOps seem to have in common. Cross-functional teams. Google being one of the slighter exceptions to this rule with the site reliability engineering, which tends to be its own kind of platform. So you've got the 2 models on one end of the scale. You've got the Google site reliability engineering team as a platform, DevOps as a platform, and then you've got the Amazon we build it, we run it kind of model at the other end of the spectrum. A lot of people tend to favour the Google model. They think it's more scalable, but I've yet to see it being successfully adopted anywhere other than at Google. But cross-functional teams tend to be the thing that we do see being a successful kind of a pattern. So if you've got cross-functional teams, have cross-functional backlogs. So why your backlog shouldn't have things like operability features in it, I don't know. I can't see one good reason why not. And if you're going to write your operability features in your backlog, and it's going to be something along the lines of deployability or scalability or something like that, you don't necessarily need to write it as a user story because there's not always a user behind it. So forget the as AI one, so that it's not necessarily going to work for your operability stories. I tend to use a model of what and why for these operability stories. What is the story and why is it needed? So what's the business justification for it? Gives a bit of context. I also move away from using the term the product backlog. I like to call this a service backlog, because if you're doing SaaS or PaaS or something like that, and that's how you're delivering your software, you're actually delivering a service. The ability to scale, the ability to roll back, the ability to deploy, that's part of the service. That might not actually be part of the product. So there's a bit of a difference between a product backlog and a service backlog. Model your flow using continuous delivery. This is all about visualizing your end-to-end system, so that everyone really understands their part. We've all heard the 3 ways, Gene Kim's 3 ways of DevOps, the systems thinking. This is about the systems thinking part. If you can model your flow in your continuous delivery pipeline, you know how important you are to it, because you're influencing it. You're not just dropping something somewhere and it's gone. You can see that it's going out to production, it's having some impact, some data is being collected, some metrics are being fed back to you. So what you're doing right now is very important because it's going to hit some user once it goes down that pipeline. So visualizing that flow really makes you feel connected. So it brings the dev and the ops teams together. Define done. Who has trouble with that? Okay. Definition of done should include things like deployed, being monitored, scalable, that kind of thing. In fact, it's Google who have that. If it's not deployable, it's not done. So deployability is a feature. So I completely agree with that. Definition of done no longer means UAT. What's UAT? Training product owner, just going back to what Husqvarna were doing there, as I say, I'm a massive fan of this. The importance of having a strong product owner and a strong product ownership model, can't say it enough, it is huge. If my sort of take on this is, if your product owner can't take your product out the back and shoot it when they decide that it's no longer fit for purpose, then they're not really a product owner, and your product ownership model can be improved. So think about that, think about financial accountability. If you really want to provide ownership of a product to an individual or to a team, these are the kind of things you need to think about. Scale out, not up. So start small. Pick a team. Create that cross-functional team with a cross-functional backlog, strong product ownership model, yada, 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 do all of the other things. Get that to be successful, and then go do it to another team. Don't just add more and more teams doing that. Don't just say, okay, now every team has to have a strong product ownership model, or we've all got to create a cross-functional backlog, and now we've all got to move on to visualizing our workflow, yada, 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 all one step at a time. No, forget that. Be agile about becoming DevOps. Don't be waterfall about it. So pick a team, let them perform, then move on. If that works, then don't change it. Go and do another team the same way. Pick another small team, create a cross-functional team, cross-functional backlog, yada, 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 scale out. And KPIs. So this is another one that has been a bit of a ball ache recently. KPI-driven development. Who feels that they're part of that world? It's quite a painful one. So a lot of organisations at the moment want to understand what their return on investment is in terms of Agile and DevOps, and they want to see that it's aligned to some sort of business value, and therefore they attach KPIs to it, but without thinking about what those KPIs are. So the minute you start to KPI something is the minute that people start to game it, or the minute they start to change their behaviour in order to achieve that KPI. So think very long and hard about that. One of the ones that we had recently was a KPI of age of stories in the backlog need to be something like, well, as short as they can be, so anything under a month. Is that a valuable KPI? No, because it's not. I'm shaking their head massively there. No, it's a terrible KPI. If you've got items in your backlog that have been there for, let's say, 6 months, it just means you're good at prioritising, and that was just a particularly low priority story. It's still there. There's no point just doing a story because you want your KPIs to be good. Let's release this story. Let's get it out in the next release, even though it's low priority, because I don't want my KPIs to look bad. So think about the KPIs that are going to be aligned to this transformation, this Agile and DevOps way of working. We talk about things like motivation. How do you measure motivation? Happiness ratings, that kind of stuff. Customer satisfaction. These are the KPIs that we should be trying to determine. And business value. I know business value is a bit of a wishy-washy one, but use that to your advantage. You can make it up. You can make up what business value is. A product owner, along with the customer, can decide what business value is. They give it a number score. Each story or each epic, what's the business value of it? I'm a product owner, I think that one's very high, I'll give it a 10. Then at the end of every iteration, how much business value did we deliver? There you go, boom, you've just measured business value.
Sorry to interrupt you, but those guys just came in. Let's do that.
Say again?
Those guys just came in.
Don't those guys just game it?
Yeah.
Well, that's where management comes in.
Yeah.
I mean,
Not my problem.
if you manage them properly, then no, they won't game it. But I used to work with an organisation, and one team, their velocity was always going up because they thought it was a good vanity metric that their velocity was good. So every sort of management meeting, it was, we produced 60 points last week, 70 points, 60 points last sprint, 70 points this sprint, and everyone was nodding, going, oh, no, that team's really good, high performers. So obviously managing that and educating that increasing your velocity and that kind of thing is probably not good. What you're looking for is sustainability. Same would go for business value. Unless there's a good reason why you'd expect it to change, then why are you gaming it? Why is it going up? What you're looking for is a process that's sustainable. Got a couple more. How are we doing for time? Ish. Okay. I've got a couple more case studies. One of them is with an organisation who decided to go on this, well, let's call it DevOps and Agile transformation, for want of a better word. And they decided to go culture first, people first. So the very first thing that they did was send all of their people on a workshop, training course, to understand what DevOps is, what it looks like, what it feels like, get a bit of basic Agile training. And that went up to management as well, so the management had training. And at the end of it, they went, oh, this is really good. Rather than actually just buy some tooling or shift everything to AWS and start using Kubernetes or whatever, they thought, let's organize the teams into cross-functional teams. And that was a huge departure for them. So they'd never done anything like that. But they did. They created these product teams. They didn't even have product teams. They just had like a dev team that worked on all dev stuff, and then sort of a support team that worked on all support stuff. So then they started to pull them together into their individual product-aligned teams. So that was a culture-first approach. They followed Scrum loosely to start off with. They liked the concept of doing two-week iterations, being able to get that fast feedback, reflect on it after 2 weeks, and then see where they can improve. And that worked really well. Until word got round that this was Scrum, and Scrum was really successful, and so they brought in a load more Scrum Masters. The Scrum Masters wanted to do Scrum by the book. Now, unfortunately, the environment is not exactly a great Scrum environment, it's more of a support-led environment. So Scrum's not a great fit. So started to hit their heads against that brick wall of trying to do Scrum in a non-Scrum environment. And DevOps was kind of going, hello, we're trying to actually envelop some of the DevOps goodness here. and this Scrum approach is actually pushing it away. Dangers of letting Scrum get a foot in the door, I suppose. It can kind of push DevOps out a little bit if you get people who are too evangelical about Scrum itself. On the other side of the spectrum, I worked with a retail organisation who wanted to go down the path of let's automate stuff, show stuff working, and we see that we've moved the lever some way, so we're going to automate deployments. And we're going to use that cloud thing, AWS. So we'll do that. It's going to be fantastic. So what they did was stand up essentially a DevOps team, which was basically a bunch of rebadged sysadmins and a couple of cloud experts, and essentially created this really cool continuous delivery pipeline that automatically deployed stuff and gave them the ability to deploy 1,000 times a year or something like that. Deploy absolute rubbish, that is, because they hadn't changed any other part of their process. They were still planning software the old way, they were still building software the old way, and they were still building really low quality stuff. So going down that DevOps approach really didn't work for them. They didn't have the change in the way that they worked in the front end. So none of these operability stories, none of this deployability stuff was actually getting into the product. So when the people were building the product, they handed over to this DevOps team, and it would be just pants. But they could deploy this pants 7 times a day or whatever. That's not really moving the bar. You know, that's not moving the bar for anyone. This is the whole point in localized optimization, punching yourself in the face thing. And yeah, those are probably the best 2 case studies in terms of the 2 ends of the spectrum. I would say probably the biggest problem is if you attach yourself too much to a framework and try and adhere to it, because at the moment there's no framework for DevOps. If someone says DevOps is about automation, it's about AWS, it's about Docker, and so, and then another person says, actually no, DevOps is about the whole end-to-end, it's about delivering the right thing faster. They would both be equally right, because there's no definition of DevOps. So it's a real struggle to sort of say whether you're doing it wrong for the right reasons or whether you're doing it right for the wrong reasons. So that's it for me. Any more people here? Okay, and is there time for questions?
Yeah, first of all, big hand for James, thank you.
Yes, you do have some time for questions. Who's got a question for Mr. Betteley? Over there.
This will depend on the kind of size of the organisation, but what kind of timeframes are we talking about here for this transformation process to take place? I mean, years? Months?
Yes, yeah. So there's another talk we do which is about why DevOps transformations are failing, and one of them is because people expect too much return on the investment in the first 6 months. It's probably not going to happen. If you start to see some return on your investment within 6 months, it's probably just going to be fake. In terms of the big picture, you're probably going to look at, well, we're 18 months into, about 18 months this month, with the organisation that went culture first, and I would say that they were looking like the best in terms of a successful DevOps transformation of a large enterprise organisation. 18 months. They are kind of questioning, are we getting the return on investment that we want now? They are now starting to automate. They probably started pressing the automation button about 12 months into the transformation, which might seem tremendously slow, and that you probably need a lot of patience from your management team to really put up with that. But it's probably the most successful implementation I've seen. We're talking about, when you use these organizations as examples, the likes of Netflix, Google, Amazon, Spotify, then you've got to appreciate that you're looking at greenfield projects there. They're greenfield organizations, there's not much going on there in terms of blockers when they start up and when they start developing these processes for practice. But that's not what the environment that most of us work in. Who would say that they worked in a brownfield environment here? So a lot quite a lot of hands there. So you've got brownfield organisations I would describe as you've got some incumbent practices, you've got some existing products, that kind of thing. Then you've got these enterprise organisations, which are a third type, which are maybe 100 years old. Some of these financial institutions, some of these engineering institutions could have been around for more than decades. And they've got these institutionalised cultures, processes, people, skill sets, all that kind of stuff. So they're not greenfield, they're not brownfield, they're minefield. These are the minefield organisations. Changing them, you've got to tread very, very carefully, because you're going to bump into someone who's probably responsible for the mess they're in anyway, and you're going to piss them off if you suggest changing anything. So yeah, you've got to be very, very careful, and you've probably got to be quite explicit right from the outset on the actual sort of time frame that you're going to be talking about. And these big organisations, big time frames. And don't believe what you read as well. With some large organisational transformations, there's one famous one that claims they did it in 6 months. And yeah, if you cut the surface on that story, you'll find that it wasn't quite that. Any others?
Any more questions?
What do you do in the situations where, as a company, you don't feel you've got enough sort of DevOps infrastructure resource to embed it in all the different global teams?
If you've not got enough DevOps infrastructure resource,
skills.
Yeah, well, yeah. To start off with, if you start small, I would say pick your A team, the usual story, create that high-performing team, sort of light the fire, get things going. If you're struggling for resources and skills then you've simply got to go to market. Anyone here in the recruiting? You've got to kind of go to market. But what you can do is you can share your resources out across multiple teams. So a bit like some Scrum Masters may service 2 teams. Skilled DevOps engineers can service more than 1 team. It depends on the level of maturity of the teams and where they are in their product life cycle. So you can sort of multiply your DevOps resources to some degree. I'm more of in favour of trying to keep them within product teams. I like the cross-functional product team model. I remember the days when people said you don't need a full-time QA person in your team. Ha! A Scrum team doesn't need a full-time QA person. A QA person can service 2 Scrum teams. Seriously. That's what people said. They said it then about UX people. You don't need a full-time UX in that product team. UX can work across several teams. They said it about DBAs. And now they're saying it about DevOps people. So, well, where's that going to go? Yeah, cross-functional teams will have dedicated DevOps resources with them, eventually. So going to market to find those resources is going to be quite challenging. Skilling up, there are some great resources available now for training and upskilling in DevOps. It's quite achievable, so you don't necessarily have to go fishing in the market for it. Upskilling your current resources is something that there are some great solutions for now.
Okay, great. So thank you, James, for a very insightful and knowledgeable talk. Let's give one more round of applause.